Welcome to Designer Masterclass. Today I'm going to show you a tutorial of how to create and use gradients in Adobe Illustrator. Now the version of Illustrator that I'm using is CS5, but if you're using CS2, 3, 4, CS6, or Creative Cloud, using the gradient tool is going to be very similar to what you see in this video. The first thing that you'll need to do is you need to open up your gradient palette. If you can't find your gradient palette, go up to Window and choose Gradient. Most of the tools that you'll use in Adobe Illustrator and palettes are underneath the menu window. You'll also need your swatches palette available. I already have mine open here on the right hand side. Again, you'll go through the same steps. If you cannot find your swatches palette, go ahead and go up to Window and choose Swatches. Now the first thing that I want to show you how to do is how to create a gradient in Illustrator. In Illustrator, it's very easy to create a gradient. All you do is simply grab the swatch and drag and drop it onto the bottom of the gradient palette. These little boxes at the bottom of the gradient palette are called color stops. You can easily add color stops by simply clicking anywhere underneath that window. You can also easily delete them by clicking on them and dragging them off the gradient tool. Again, to create your gradient, you simply drag and drop a swatch onto those color stops. Now in Illustrator, there are two types of gradients that you can work with. You have linear gradient and you also have a radial gradient. I'm going to show you the difference in just a minute. Now before we use a gradient, we need to have an object to apply the gradient to. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw a perfect square. Keep in mind, while holding Shift in Adobe Illustrator and using any of the shape tools, we'll create a perfectly proportioned symmetrical shape by simply holding Shift when you draw. Now, I have already applied the gradient to the shape because I had the gradient selected when I drew the shape. But let's say that you wanted to change the direction of this gradient. You didn't want it to go from green on the left to blue on the right. You wanted it to be blue on the top and green on the bottom. What you would do is you would select the gradient tool itself in the tool panel palette. To automatically bring you to this tool, you can hit the letter G as in gradient on your toolbar. As soon as you have the gradient tool selected, you'll notice that a new menu or a new option shows up on your shapes. And you can see your color stops. You can also see the transition where that color happens. Okay, while you have the gradient tool selected, you can easily manipulate your gradients. You can even add color stops on the gradients as well. Now to change the direction of the gradient, you might have noticed that your cursor has now turned to a crosshair. That means that you can now draw with this object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag on my object to change the direction of my gradient. You can also toggle the direction of your gradients on the gradient menu over here by simply clicking the button underneath the gradient fill icon. If you hover your mouse over it, it will say reverse gradient. So when I hit that button, you'll see that indeed it does reverse the gradient. Now I can also lay the gradient on an object at an angle or any direction that I would like. Okay, so that's how you use the linear gradient tool in Illustrator. The next thing that I want to show you is how to use the radial gradient. I'm going to create a different color combination here. So again, to create a gradient, you simply drag and drop the swatches to those color stops on the bottom of the menu. I've now created a three-tone gradient, and you can see in the window here, this little preview window, that it's a radial gradient, or it looks like a circular gradient. That's what a radial gradient is. So again, I'm going to grab another shape tool. I'm going to grab a circle. I'm going to hold Shift as I draw this circle, because I want to make sure that I have a perfectly proportioned circle, and you can see that the radial gradient has been applied to it. Now you can switch between the gradients very easily by grabbing this menu over here and changing the type. And then you can change the gradient on this object the same way that you can, or the same way that I showed you on the square. You can also adjust the color stops now that it's applied to that object. And you can also change the direction of that gradient on that shape. Now keep in mind, when you're working with a radial gradient, it's going to be drawing from the middle, meaning that it's going to apply this to a radial shape. So you'll notice when you draw with this tool, it's different than when you do with the linear gradient tool. All right, so there's our today's tutorial about how to create and use gradients in Adobe Illustrator. Have a great day.